Tariffs. What are they and why do they matter? Let's talk about it. The tariff was one of the first acts signed into law by Congress in 1789, and it had two main purposes: to promote trade and to provide revenue for the federal government. And at the time, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and many others in Congress were strong proponents of this act and viewed it as a key way in protecting American manufacturing from foreign competition and promoting long-term industrial growth, which marked the beginning of the protectionist movement and the ending of the pre-revolution period, which had notable events like the Townshend Act of 1767, Boston Massacre, Boston Tea Party, taxation without representation, and before all of that, the 7 Years' War. The Tariff Act of 1789 taxed most imported goods at 5% of their value, while taxing other things like wine, for example, differently. And because history often repeats itself, the Tariff Act was not really popular amongst Americans at that time, much like how Trump's proposed tariff increases aren't really popular amongst many Americans today. But as you move along the timeline of our history with tariffs, you'll find it's a little bit of a roller coaster. In 1812, during the war against Great Britain, tariffs doubled. In 1816, a new Tariff Act was put in place with levies 42% higher than they were just prior to the war. Economic crisis hits in 1820, sparks the Great Tariff Controversy, and this is when the American population really started to get behind the idea that placing tariffs on imported goods was actually beneficial to the well-being and economic health of the country. And at least at that time, tariffs accounted for 90% of the country's revenue, and tariff revisions were made every 5 years or so, which kinda seems exhausting. But this was primarily due to the Senate and House versions of each proposed tariff act differing substantially, and lobbyists, good old lobbyists, from different industries putting pressure on the government to influence an outcome in their favor. So not much has changed there at all. And as time moved on, right before the South separated to become the Confederacy, the North wanted to raise tariffs while the South found no benefit in doing so because they had very little manufacturing infrastructure. And this struggle between the North and the South ended with tariff rates being set at 20%. Until the Civil War, where the North rose tariffs again. When we start getting into the early 1900s, that's when tariffs were looked at a little bit differently, because now that we had income tax, tariffs weren't the main driving force behind revenue generation, leading policymakers to push for a lower tariff rate, thus bringing us out of the protectionist time period in favor of a more free trade standard. However, that's not before the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which could be seen as making the Great Depression worse because of increased tariffs on farm products and manufactured goods, which caused other nations also suffering from economic crisis to raise tariffs on goods from the US, bringing global trade to a standstill until about 1934. But other than that not so minor hiccup, tariffs stayed relatively low, starting at 20% on the high end and dropping to 4% for much of the 20th century. And things really start to change once Donald Trump took office in 2016, shifting us to a neo-protectionist standard. Trump imposed a 30 to 50% tariff on solar panels and washing machines, a 25% tariff on steel, and 10% tariff on aluminum. Trump also imposed a separate set of tariffs on China under Section 301, which essentially catapulted the US and several other countries into a trade war where they placed retaliatory tariffs on US goods. And of course, throughout his presidency, these metrics changed based on several different reasons that I'm not going to get into because. But just taking a look at the Chinese imports we put tariffs on is actually nuts. It's a very long list. A very long list. And it applies to over $300 billion worth of imports, with the highest tariff rate for items like semiconductors and solar cells and electric vehicles being 25%. And throughout the Biden administration, a lot of these tariffs were kept in place and some even increased. Now we've arrived to more current times. Donald Trump's second term is on the horizon, and he's proposed a 10 to 20% tariff across the board, with a 60% tariff on Chinese imports in an effort to drive down national debt and bring jobs back to American soil. How effective that'll be, only time will tell, but what does that mean for you as a consumer? Higher tariffs on imported goods means that the businesses doing the importing are going to pass that cost down to you, which more often than not disproportionately affects lower income consumers who are already strapped for cash and small businesses who have to import goods. So for simple math here, say a local business imports a set of solar panels for $200 and then sells it to you at $300, allowing them to profit $100. If there's a 10% tariff tax, the same set of solar panels is going to have to be imported now at $220, which means the business is going to sell them to you at $320 to keep the same $100 profit margin. And the same logic can be applied to things like ESCs, flight controllers, laptops, or whatever electronics you dabble in. There's also speculation that the price of things like laptops and tablets might rise by 46%, and smartphones might rise by 26%. And for how long these prices stay high depends on how many businesses on American soil can produce the same product at a competitive price point. Or if the Trump administration decides to change tariff rates again, which wouldn't be uncommon if you look at history. Although Donald Trump does have a reputation for being firm on his proposed tariff rates, I wouldn't take that as a reason to start panic buying. It's a little too early to know exactly what's going to happen when he takes office again next year, and to be honest, panic buying is a loser's game. We've seen during recent events how desperate people can get during times of uncertainty, leading them to overstocking on bullshit like toilet paper or water. Which sounds a little less weird until you realize that our water is manufactured here in America. But in general, it kinda makes you look like a dickhead. Don't be the guy with 10 flight controllers and 8 motors in your cart. 9 times out of 10, you're not gonna use them all anyway. And that kind of goes for anything where there's a perceived shortage. Unless you're in dire straits, just don't. But hopefully this video provided you some insight about what tariffs are and the history behind them and what they mean for the consumer. I know I learned a lot putting this video together for you all. If you feel like it helped you, let me know in the comment section. If not, my bad. Thanks for watching, guys. Like and subscribe. Catch you later.